Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go. Free to come and free to go. Open up the book of stars. Open up the
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking's podcast. I'm your host, SHERI HASAN of Karmic Evolution Astrology, and I'm coming to you on November 3rd, 2023 from karmicevolution.com or any of your favorite podcast stations. Just a quick reminder that this show aims to bring you the truth about astrology and your soul's karmic evolution. First, the housekeeping stuff, which is to tell you a new show will drop every Friday at 11 a.m. Pacific and 2 p.m. Eastern. And if you do go to karmicevolution.com, you will see there a downloadable freebie called How to Keep Your Sun Sign Happy, which, as I explain every week, is friendly advice that I've been given permission to distribute by renowned evolutionary astrologer Stephen Forrest, because it's from an interview I did with him a couple of years ago. And it is advice about how to keep your sun sign happy. Well, that's what it says, right? Also, if you miss any podcasts and you'd like to go back and review them, you can always go to karmicevolution.com and just scroll down the page and go to the podcast that you missed. Separately, you can follow me on Karmic Evolution for Your Soul on Facebook and karmic.evolution on Instagram. And I am still offering the Karmic, I offer a 75-minute discounted Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading for only $125, which is for radio show, I call you radio show because we used to do the Contact Talk Radio is what it's called, that hosted my show and still does, but for podcast listeners only. You've graduated. We're all podcast listeners now. Personally, I don't know about you, but I don't like to sit and watch a talking head, unless, of course, there's charts and stuff, which does make a difference when you're listening to an astrology lecture. But, you know, those of us who are bitten so passionately by the astrology bug can always go look up a chart or, we have our own software or whatever. But anyway, if you want to learn more about the true meaning of your individual birth chart, in order to gain greater consciousness about your life, about your soul's true mission and purpose in this lifetime, then this discounted reading is for you. So it's designed to help you move from chaos to clarity, not only about why you're here, but also what might be holding you back from achieving your highest destiny in this lifetime. So a Karmic Evolution Natal Insight reading can reveal how the energies into which you were born, as I said, may be holding you back because they keep you stuck in old, habitual, past, or early life behavioral patterns. So understanding such conditioned soul behavior then can assist you to make different, more positive choices moving forward, especially in the areas that are of greatest interest to you. It could be your relationships, your career and your job, your finances, or your health. So if you'd like to create your own future happiness through astrological insight, then again, this reading is for you. As I like to say, conscious awareness has never been so easy or so affordable when you take advantage of my special discounted offer, which you can find at karmicevolution.com/karmic125. And once again, I just wanted to let everyone know, on Sunday will be class number 3 of my 8-week class titled Intro to Aspects, How to Get to the Heart of the Chart. And if you, like I just mentioned before, if you become passionate about astrology, you know, you've studied or you know the basic meaning of the planets, the signs and the houses, and you're ready to learn what actually brings a chart to life, then this is a class you might not want to miss. And even though it's begun already, there are recordings, so it isn't like you wouldn't miss out on anything. You would have missed 2 classes if you sign up before Sunday, or 3 by then. But it is still open for enrollment. So if you're ready to take the next step in your astrological journey toward learning how to decipher the fuller meaning of an entire chart's energies, it's little by little by little, right? I'll help you hone your chart reading skills as we delve more deeply into the meaning of the major aspects: conjunctions, sextiles, squares, trines, oppositions, and grand trines, grand crosses, things like that. We will probably get also later in the class into some of the minor aspects like the semi-sextile and the semi-square and the quincunx. But we'll do that because, these aspects make up what I like to call the skeleton of the chart, right? Then we can hang the flesh on it, not to be, gross, but it is like still almost sort of Halloween, right? Anyway, we'll do that by studying the charts of well-known people to verify exactly how their chart not only depicts or depicted their energies, but exactly how they chose or are choosing to manifest these out in the world. So if you want more information or you want to sign up, just go to aspnj.org. That's Astrological Society of Princeton, New Jersey, aspnj.org, because I'm teaching under their auspices. And if you have any questions about being a late starter, feel free to email me at SHERI, that's SHERI, at karmicevolution.com. All right, so let's get into this week's Astro News. Now, I have so much to talk about this week that inevitably when this happens, it gets confusing. Because I like to go back and I like to look at last week. Last week, of course, almost a week ago, we had the October 28th lunar eclipse. And it's hard to go back and then go forward. So I have stuff that I'm going to leave out. And some of it might include the situation in Israel. This is a heart-wrenching situation there. I have already said in my past podcasts, I don't want to get into the politics of it, just the astrology. And I will do that a little bit, but please know that I'm not neglecting it. It just is really, and I will talk about this a little bit later, a real confirmation on the astrological side that since the October 14th Libra new moon solar eclipse, and even before that, as I've mentioned on the show, the alignment and realignment of partnerships. Now, I've said that, I feel like, almost a million times. It's still going on, and it's still very serious. So we'll talk about it, but I don't want to dwell on it too much because, again, it is just a heartbreaking situation. So, we'll take a little bit look at the energies ahead and see whether they might be fortuitous or not. In terms of, fortuitous to me means a ceasefire, and a resolution without the death of more people, especially women and children. But first, let's take a look back, which is what I like to do, and go back to October 25th as the monthly, which was, last week, as the monthly lunar cycle was still waxing, right, from, again, that October 14th Libra new moon cycle. And 3 days before we hit the Taurus full moon lunar eclipse on October 28th, the moon conjoined Neptune in Pisces, and a mentally ill man shot and killed 18 people and wounded 13 more at 2 different locations, a bowling alley and a restaurant, bar, and grill in Lewiston, Maine. Now, there shouldn't be anyone on the planet who hasn't heard about this yet, but regardless, what I want to point out again is to stick to the astrology. So we might want to notice now, in retrospect, how the moon conjoined Neptune, the planet of illusion, confusion, and delusion, at 10:22 p.m. Eastern Time on that night of October 25th. And we might now, too, recognize that one of these shootings occurred at the, and I don't know if I'm pronouncing this right, but Shemenji's Bar and Grill, which clearly served alcohol, and another at Spare Time Recreation Bowling Alley, which is connected to the Ground Round Grill. And from what I could tell from a quick internet search, the Ground Round Grill serves beer, at least, to customers of a legal age as well. So I thought that was interesting, but also, has anybody noticed that the shooting occurring at the Spare Time Recreation's bowling alley happened during its cornhole tournament for deaf athletes? So let's take a moment to dissect the symbolism of people who cannot hear being attacked by a volley of bullets coming from a sniper's rifle. In other words, might the death of several deaf people symbolize the deaf ear that many, especially those in Congress untouched personally by such mass murderers using weapons of war, have turned to the issue of gun control on a national level. Further, it took attacking a gathering with deaf residents in a small town in Maine, one very far removed from Washington, D.C., where gun regulation policies can, and I would add should, be federally legislated, for a local GOP elected official from that Lewiston, Maine town, in fact, to change his objections to gun restrictions. So this, to me, lends a lot of credence to how so many turn a blind eye to the so far 566 mass shootings this year alone in America, simply because they haven't experienced anything like that in their own backyards. So two things here. The first is what I just said, which is that state governments, along with the national one, or the federal one, have turned a deaf ear to so many common sense gun laws, such as background checks, red flag laws, minimum ages for gun purchase, and much more. And second, that it raises the question of what it will take for us to literally hear on both a state and a national level that anyone can be shot and killed at any time because this country lacks sensible gun restrictions on its sales, both its sales and its uses. All right, turning to another subject, it was also October 25th when Louisiana House of Representatives or Representative Mike Johnson became the Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives, a longtime conservative who refers people to the Bible when he's asked about his basic philosophy of life, and that presumably includes his philosophy of governing, since clearly they asked him that question when he became the new Speaker in, his office or on the floor of the House or something. Johnson was voted in by other GOP reps who knew nothing about his background. More confusion, illusion, delusion, moon, Neptune in Pisces energy, you think? Several House members said they had to look him up, which they did after they voted him in his new speakership position without knowing a damn thing about him first. So we mustn't be surprised then if his tenure is filled with delusional thinking on his part, like he's already demonstrated by proposing legislation to fund Israel to the tune of $14 billion, while A, demanding that this funding be tied to $14 billion, actually I think it's $12 billion in spending cuts it's $14 billion in spending cuts to the IRS, which the Congressional Budget Office estimates will add $12 billion, actually it was $100 billion to the national debt over 10 years, and B, it's a bill that contains no funding for Ukraine. Now, I don't know if I have to remind you, but President Biden and the administration, of course, is asking for, I think it's something like $60 billion for Ukraine and the $14 billion for Israel, and then there's some money also for the Palestinians, I believe. I don't know if that's changed. Now, the House is voting on that bill. I record this, as I've said many times before, on Thursday evenings, and the House hasn't voted, but they're supposed to take it up tonight, unless they have delayed it. So that there might be an answer to this bill and whether it's going to pass by tomorrow when you're listening to this. But regardless, on November 1st, the Washington Post wrote, quote, GOP plan to fund Israel aid with IRS cuts would cost $90 billion, tax chief says. And I'm still quoting, reducing funds for the tax agency is a top priority of House Republicans, setting up a budget clash with the Senate and the White House. Remember, alignment and realignment of partnerships, even more so than has been going on over the last couple of years. House Republicans plan to pay for, this is the article again, emergency aid to Israel by cutting the Internal Revenue Service's budget would increase the deficit by $90 billion over 10 years, the chief of the tax agency said Tuesday. I got a little over anxious and forgot I had it in here. I said $100 billion, but okay, what's another $10 billion, right? Seeking to pay for $14 billion, again quoting, of proposed aid to Israel sought by both parties, Speaker Mike Johnson on Monday unveiled legislation that would cut roughly $14 billion from funds recently approved by Democrats to expand the to expand the IRS. But Daniel Werfel, who was nominated by President Biden as the IRS commissioner last year, said the cuts would lead to greater expense by reducing audits of the wealthy and large corporations and hampering the agency's ability to collect revenue that funds the government. The nonpartisan Congressional Budget Office said last year that the $80 billion IRS expansion would cut the deficit by more than $100 billion. That's where I got the $100 billion from, by improving collections and enforcement. The IRS expansion was approved to pay for Democrats' Inflation Reduction Act, Biden's signature economic legislation from 2022. And according to the IRS itself, on October 20th, progress has already been made. And here I quote from their website, the IRS is working to ensure large corporate and high-income individual filers pay the taxes they owe. Prior to the Inflation Reduction Act, more than a decade of budget cuts prevented the IRS from keeping pace with the increasingly complicated set of tools that the wealthiest taxpayers use to hide their income and evade paying their share. The IRS is now taking swift and aggressive action to close this gap. And they continued, following a dramatically improved 2023 filing season, thanks to Inflation Reduction Act, known as the IRA investments, the Internal Revenue Services has targeted IRA resources on strengthening enforcement with announcements on new initiatives to pursue high-income, high-wealth individuals who do not pay overdue tax bills and complex partnerships. Today, and this was from October 20th, as I said, the IRS announced new initiatives to ensure large corporations pay taxes owed. As these initiatives to improve compliance among high-income individuals, complex partnerships, and large corporations ramp up, the IRS is continuing its work to improve customer service and modernize core technology infrastructure, most notably with the launch of Business Tax Account. I'm not sure if that's the free service, because you can file your taxes using the IRS website for free. I don't know what the stipulations are for that, but you can look at it. You can research it if it's something you might want to use. So I am always amazed at how fiscal austerity types, those who come from the Ronald Reagan era, are so bad at math. Anywho, I did a little digging into Mike Johnson's untimed natal chart last week. And again, he was born on January 30th, 1972 in Shreveport, Louisiana. And because his chart is untimed, we have no legitimate birth time for him. I always use a noon chart, which will put the sun at the top. What I forgot to tell you last week is that the 5-degree, 9-minute Taurus full moon lunar eclipse fell square to his natal nodal axis at 5 degrees and 3 minutes. That's his Leo south node and Aquarius North Node. So we don't know the houses, but I think it's interesting too that he's got a 9-degree 57-minute Aquarius Sun, which is conjunct his North Node. So this eclipse squared his nodes nearly exact, and then also very wide squared his Sun too. Now, astrologically speaking, squares occur between incompatible or antagonistic elements, which denotes that they'll contain a certain degree of tension. Though squares produce tension and strain, they represent the energy of being stretched or placed in positions where one might suppress emotions or excitement, but then later explode. And this is a quote: "Too much living in a highly pressurized state, too much tension can exhaust us, grind us down, make us old before our time, break and cripple us to the extent that we become incapable of doing anything at all." And that's a quote from Sue Tompkins, the author of the book Aspects in Astrology. But squares are also aspects that spur us into action, she says, and its tensions stretch us in order to make us grow as we become aware of the person we are here to become. Meanwhile, and in addition, transiting Jupiter, which is retrograde, is waxing back to almost square Johnson's karmic natal nodes again. Jupiter did so already when it was in forward motion initially back on June 9th. And this speaks of the potential for arrogance or hubris to impede his progress toward his North Node in Aquarius goal, which is to work within a group towards humanitarian goals. And in Johnson's case, I think we can agree that this may very well prove problematic for him in the sense that he's almost more right-wing than Attila the Hun in terms of the societal goals he's pursuing in Congress. And a bunch of people who knew nothing about Johnson, as I said before, voted for him for the top GOP position in the House on a Moon-Neptune night. According to MSNBC, and here I quote, "Mike Johnson, the new Republican Speaker of the House, is not exactly a well-known figure. When his GOP colleagues made him second in line to the presidency last week, Senator Susan Collins, the Republican from Maine, was so unfamiliar with him that she told a reporter she would have to Google him. All that will likely change between now and next November. Johnson is and this is not me speaking, this is the MSNBC, which is admittedly left-leaning. Johnson is a Trump-loving, election-denying, abortion ban supporting, gay rights opposing, climate change rejecting, and conspiracy believing conservative. If House Democrats are smart, they will turn Mike Johnson into a household name, though not in a good way. And already dubbed MAGA Mike, which I might have mentioned last week, I'm not sure, by people like Florida Representative Matt Gaetz, that moniker is likely to stick and be used against him by Democrats as they seek to gain control of the House in the upcoming 2024 elections. But the question is, will Johnson last as Speaker? So we know that he's a religious fanatic, which automatically makes his views narrow and therefore more egotistically righteous. Meanwhile, Jupiter's retrograding back to square his Sun exactly on November 7th, and will stop just short of re-squaring his natal nodes again when Jupiter stations direct at 5 degrees and 35 minutes of Taurus on December 30th. So it'll come within less than a degree, or about a degree, of his nodes. 30 minutes, about 30 minutes of his nodes. It's 5:09 to 5:35, right? In any case, while Jupiter's current square to his Sun may provide Johnson with some expanded opportunities, well, I mean, it's pretty obvious it already has, right? It can also, quote, encourage ego inflation and excessive pride, according to Rob Hand, the author of Planets in Transit. He says, be careful not to act in an overbearing manner, for you will set people in motion who will try to knock you down a peg or two. Johnson can either understand his limitations and act accordingly, especially when it comes to Jupiter's connection with law, given that Johnson is a legislator who helps to make laws, or he might, and here again I quote from Ramhan, overstep his bounds and trigger conflict with the law or with someone else in a court of law. Well, I think we can extrapolate from Hand's words that we can include, when he says court of law, the House of Representatives as one branch of the legislature, which helps make the law. So the law connection is very clear. In addition, though, transiting Pluto sitting smack on his natal Mercury, and both are right now at 28 degrees and 1 minute of Capricorn. And this indicates a bit of, shall we say, obsession with one's ideas, particularly to the point where coercion or manipulation can come into play. And again, Rob Hand puts it this way, and here I quote, "This transit gives you the power to influence people and sway them to your point of view. However, if you try to convince people from a narrow, egotistical point of view," and I remind you here that I talked last week about the fact that Johnson is a Leo South node, meaning we look at the negative traits of Leo when we're looking at the South node, because those are the ones we want to leave behind. We want to bring forward the ones that have helped us because they're the higher end of the archetypal energy of Leo. Creativity, passion, pride, all those things that work well when, one is open-hearted and generous, but not so much when one is egotistical and all about themselves. So Johnson's trying to convince people from a narrow, egotistical point of view seems like a distinct possibility right now. And, I interrupted Rob Hand's quote. So he says, however, if you try to convince people from a narrow, egotistical point of view, not because of a real concern with truth, you will prove opposition to your ideas. You will provoke opposition to your ideas, which could defeat you. Plutonian energies are not easily harnessed to egotistical motives, Hand concludes. Now, Rob Hand writes and talks an awful lot about Pluto, and if you have the Pluto, Planets and Transits book, you can see that easily. But Pluto is the outermost planet within the solar system, and it's a societal planet. It's a collective planet. Uranus, Neptune, and Pluto are all considered collective planets, which is why I think he says that. I mean, people might think, in other words, it can be used, its energies, especially its the sign that it rules, Pluto, Scorpio, can be used to manipulate. But, if you're using that power for negative manipulation, meaning, you want to cheat somebody or lie to somebody for your own personal gain, or for, in order to gain more power over them, then he's saying that, it'll come back to bite you in the end. In any case, we'll see if Johnson's fantasy of remaining speaker till or beyond then holds true. Let's note, too, that no matter how you slice it, we've been seeing, as I said before at the beginning, we've been seeing partnerships align and realign since the lead up to the Libra new moon solar eclipse on October 14th, and even before the Taurus full moon lunar eclipse on October 28th, we began to see that its message to release chaos and discord in favor of peace, calm, and serenity, between these, we also began to see how between these two eclipses, people flipped, right? I mentioned this last week, I think, so I'm not going to go into it in detail. Like, people who went from co-defendants, Trump co-defendants in these lawsuits against him, are now witnesses on the other side. So instead of being co-defendants with him, they are now witnesses against him, right? Now, I wanted to mention, too, that in terms of this legislation I was just talking about with the IRS, defunding the IRS in order to fund Israel, that Chuck Schumer, the Democratic majority leader in the Senate, and the minority GOP leader, Mitch McConnell, are actually on the same page, because they don't want the House to send them a bill that only funds the Israeli cause right now. They insist that that cause is tied to the Ukrainian cause, because Russia is the perpetrator, aggressor against Ukraine, and Iran is the funder of a lot of the terrorist action that happened by order of Hamas, and they also fund Hezbollah, and I think the Islamic Jihad also, they might be funded by one of the other, I can't remember if it's another country, but in any case, all that is easily researchable. But the thing is that it's really weird, especially after or since the Trump administration, to have the two leaders of the GOP and the majority and minority in the Senate and Democrats actually agree on something. Now, McConnell walks a fine line, right? Because he'll disagree with everything else, or he'll hem and haw and claim that he's not agreeing. But Chuck Schumer today, I believe, announced that the Senate isn't even going to pay any attention to the House bill if it's passed tonight or tomorrow or any other time, and they're simply going to work on their own bill that includes Ukraine funding. So again, this realignment of partnerships is really kind of interesting. So let's remember, too, that at this most recent eclipse, the October 28th Taurus full moon lunar eclipse, that Mars in Scorpio opposed Jupiter retrograde in Taurus exact just before the Taurus moon opposed the Scorpio sun, and that lunation perfected. And then, as Mercury in Scorpio opposed Jupiter retrograde in Taurus as well. And the next day, on October 29th, Mercury and Mars conjoined exact, both still in opposition to Jupiter. So aside from that mass shooting in Maine happening 3 days before, just hours before the eclipse, Mike Pence dropped out of the GOP presidential primary race. Now, born June 7th, 1959, in Columbus, Indiana, and sadly, again, we have no birth time for him, it looks like his 4-degree, 34-minute Neptune in Scorpio got caught in the crosshairs of the October 28th lunar eclipse, when the Scorpio sun conjoined and the Taurus moon opposed it. Now, the Taurus moon opposition to Neptune in his chart would seem to imply that his bid for, the transit, that's what I'm saying, that the full moon caught his Neptune, which had, Taurus opposite Neptune in Scorpio. That's what I'm getting at. The Taurus, this is a Taurus Pisces or a Venus Neptune, combined with the moon kind of energy, and the sun in Scorpio, would seem to imply that his bid for president was based more on fantasy than on reality. In addition, transiting Saturn, which is at 0 degrees and 33 minutes of Pisces, was quincunx his natal Venus, which sits at 0 degrees 47 minutes of Leo. And a quincunx is always an adjustment, or tells us we need to make an adjustment. So he also has a natal Venus-Neptune fixed square. So this eclipse essentially squared that, creating a grand fixed cross, kind of like what happened in Mike Johnson's chart, only his was with the nodes. So Venus square Neptune, which is natal for him, can often manifest as unrealistic expectations, particularly in relationships, or more wishful thinking than reality-based knowing. And finally, the almost stationed right now, transiting Saturn at 0:30 Pisces, is quincunxing his natal 0:47 Leo Venus, and will wax into a quincunx to his 3-degree 56-minute Mars in Leo by January 8th, 2024, by which time his presidential motivations, and I guess this maybe seems kind of obvious, may have completely dissolved. But the question then will be who he actually endorses in the upcoming GOP primary. And that will be very interesting to learn. But, whether that adjustment for him takes him out of the realm of backing former President Trump and into supporting someone else remains to be seen. Also, several hours after that October 28th lunar eclipse, we learned of the drowning death of Matthew Perry, one of the co-stars of the popular sitcom Friends, who apparently died in his hot tub at his home in LA. Born August 19th, 1969 at 4:47 a.m. in North Adams, Massachusetts, Perry was a first-house Leo sun, a fourth-house Scorpio moon, and a Leo rising. In psychological astrology, his fourth-house Neptune, along with his natal Sun-Neptune square, they can often indicate a missing father. So given that his mother divorced his father and moved from, I think, Massachusetts, to Ontario, Canada, when Perry was only 6 months old, this would seem to prove true. And although she remarried, Perry moved back to his father's home in LA at 15 to pursue an acting career. So while the Sun-Neptune square can often manifest as someone who's unsure of his own ego identity or persona, and that's mostly due on the psychological level to not having a strong male figure in his life, it can a good actor make. If you think of the word chameleon, or one's ability to take on character roles, for example, by pretending to be someone else, which is what most actors do, right? You'll understand what I mean by that. Now, the Sun-Neptune in frictional aspect in charts can also be a sign of addiction, which sadly turned out to be true in Perry's case. He published his memoir, Friends, Lovers, and the Big Terrible Thing, a memoir, which added to revelations about his battle with addiction, including a near-death experience in 2019 after his colon burst as a result of his use of opioids. So it was no secret, that he definitely had addiction issues. Now, his fourth house, 7-degree 39-minute Scorpio moon, also squared his 10-degree 41-minute Leo ascendant and the same degree Aquarius descendant, the relationship axis, creating tension in his romantic relationships and possibly others as well. Reportedly a big problem for most of his life. So his ascendant moon and sun, ascendant square the moon, or the moon square the ascendant, descendant, because the moon moves faster, so it's doing the squaring, and the sun square Neptune in his chart, both of them undoubtedly made him unsure of himself in relationships. And in addition, his moon was opposing Saturn, which may well have left him feeling often lonely, isolated, undeserving, less than, or depressed at times. So it's well, again, documented that he was an addict using both drugs and alcohol to escape. And again, the Neptune connections in his chart speak to that pretty well. So when the lunar eclipse at 5:09 Taurus and Scorpio hit his fourth house 7:39 Scorpio moon and his 8:56 Taurus Saturn, which oppose each other, right? It triggered that, basically, there's something there about the loss of the mother, So from the sound of it, his mother got remarried, had more children, and I read something, whether it was in one of his obituaries or whatever, that he moved at 15 to be with his father in LA, not only because he was a budding actor, but I think he felt like he was the odd man out, as the only child from a different marriage, and she had other kids. So he had half siblings, but he didn't really feel accepted there. So, the other thing is that the Sun square opposite Neptune, in addition to being a kind of emotional chameleon, right? It means that, the person may osmose the feelings of other people easily, but also that they fail to separate or maintain strong emotional boundaries with others. So, sad, but true. I want to mention that also today, yesterday and this morning early, there was a Sun-Jupiter opposition, Scorpio to Taurus. Jupiter's still retrograde, as I mentioned. And again, in alignment with discussions about partnerships, right? The Sun opposite Jupiter is a little bit like what I was talking about with the Jupiter square to the Sun in Mike Johnson's chart, right? It can denote arrogance. It can be hubris, right? And again, under the banner of this realignment of partnerships, in the news these past few days, and this is from November 1st, today's the 3rd, that going back to the topic of Israel, that some of the South American countries are breaking with Israel. According to the New York Times on November 1st, Bolivia cuts diplomatic ties with Israel over its strikes in Gaza. And Bolivia has severed relations with Israel over its strikes on Gaza, a diplomatic decision that Israel condemned as, quote, surrender to terrorism, even as its own ties with other countries in Latin America begin to fray. The governments of Chile and Colombia said on Tuesday that they were recalling their ambassadors to Israel for consultations in light of the strikes on Gaza, which have been in response to the October 7th Hamas-led attack on Israel that killed about 1,400 people. End quote. Also, the New York Times on November 1st, as we wax towards this Sun-Jupiter opposition, said, wrote, and I quote here, after 3 weeks of thwarted hopes and intensive diplomatic negotiations, the first group of people to evacuate Gaza since the war between Israel and Hamas began on October 7th was beginning to arrive in Egypt. So I want to note that we also have on Wednesday, which was the same day, the 1st, that Mercury in Scorpio was quincunx wounded healer Chiron in Aries. So hearing news or stories about those who've been wounded or are in need makes sense. So the piece says thousands of foreign passport holders, and this has been all over the news, so you guys probably heard it already, and people affiliated with international organizations are set to evacuate to Egypt, and they already have been. There among them are several seriously injured Palestinians, and there are some Americans. I saw one interviewed earlier today on TV, and there's supposed to be more coming, right? So there's continued talks, again, in alignment of partnerships between Israel, Egypt, Hamas, the United States, and Qatar. So, they took initially 81 wounded people for treatment in Egypt, and according to Gazan authorities and Egyptian state media. And, initially the first group was about 130 people who were managed to leave. So starting today, Thursday, 1,000 foreign passport holders and Palestinian staff members of international organizations are expected to leave via the Rafah crossing, according to Western diplomats in Cairo. But, they're continuing, which is a good thing after weeks of stalled negotiations between the parties that I just mentioned. So there were, agreements suddenly came together this week. And so the Sun opposite Jupiter can also be good news or good fortune, right? And on the other hand, we might overestimate and think everything's going to be great, There's a kind of weird symmetry between those two planets where if it's in a natal chart, for example, one can sometimes think that, not very much of themselves, and at other times they think they're great. So there's sort of a back and forth, a little bit of a bipolar thing going on there. So, I think we're seeing that now. And again, when Mercury quincunx Chiron, which I mentioned already, according to the New York Times, it was waxing on October 31st when the Times reported communication and internet services have been cut again in the Gaza Strip. The enclave's main telecommunication provider said, and that was on, again, Wednesday, November 1st. So, we still have, this sort of back and forth stuff, right? And I would mention, too, that again, going back just for a moment to the House of Representatives and Congress in general, is that with the sun opposite Jupiter and all this BS that's going on with these bills, they've only got 3 weeks before the budget defaults here in the United States. They've got to do something and pass some of these aid packages. Financial aid to Ukraine and the House resistance, again, while Senate Majority Leader McConnell sees it as imperative that Congress support the Ukrainians in their fight against the Russian invasion. And here's a quote: "We got 3 weeks to get this done," one GOP senator told Punchbowl News. "If we don't, we're telling Russia they can go have Ukraine." Right? So, so that's interesting. Now, I think, too, it is entirely possible that later today, about 3 o'clock Pacific and 6 p.m. Eastern, the Venus in Virgo opposition to Neptune in Pisces culminates. And so I think with what's going on here, I don't know how that's going to pan out, like I said, in the House with this budget stuff, but I think in terms of Gaza and the Israeli situation, there may be some hope. It's just a matter of containing that a little, because combined with the sun opposite Jupiter, we might start to think, oh good, everything's going to calm down and everything's going to be fine. And that may not actually be the case, especially since on the 4th, Mercury in Scorpio will oppose Uranus and Taurus. All right, that could be some news of the unexpected kind. And on the 5th, Mars in Scorpio will quincunx Chiron in Aries. That is not a good combination. When you have Scorpio and Aries, that's a 150 degree by element, and Scorpio is ruled by Pluto, Aries by Mars. One of the planets involved is Mars. The other one is wounded healer. So I would look for some kind of over-optimism to perhaps be dashed. I mean, I hope like hell that's not true. I would love to be wrong. But it will also occur at the 3rd quarter lunar monthly square of the Leo moon to, of the Leo moon to the Scorpio sun early on Sunday the 5th. And then that's followed by the moon square Mars and the moon square Uranus and the moon square Venus. So it doesn't look that good. But in the short time. But on the other hand, maybe that's good for objections in the House. All right. So what I want to get to, which everyone else all over the internet, of course, is talking about, and all the other podcast astrologers, is the station of Saturn direct on November 4th. I will talk about this more in the future. It's not like as soon as it stations, because Saturn's going to stay. It's already been at the same degree for about 3 weeks, and it'll stay at that degree for the most part, moving very slowly forward for another 3 weeks. So if it is in aspect to any major planets or angles in your chart, it is still going to be pretty much moving very slowly. Now, I wanted to remind people that this Saturn transit started, Saturn station retrograde on June 17th at 7 degrees and 13 minutes of Pisces. All right, so it went from 0 Pisces to 7. I think it went into Pisces, if I'm not wrong, and I think it was March 4th, but it was March when it went in. Okay, so it moved forward and then it moved back. So now it is stationing at 031 Pisces. But in between, after it stationed retrograde on June 17th, it then opposed Saturn, which is was occurred on August 27th. That was the halfway point. And then the Libra Sun quincunxed Saturn on September 24th, and then the Scorpio Sun trined Saturn on September 24th. No, I'm sorry, October 24th. So I'm sorry if I sound confused, but I hope I'm not confusing you. And now it's going to station direct on November 4th, again at 031 Pisces. So what I wanted to talk about, although I am going to run out of time, is that journey, right? But let me leave you with this, because at least part of it, right? Something is dying to be reborn. It's not that Saturn is Pluto, but there are some similarities to a certain extent. So from the station direct to the previous retrograde degree, which it will hit on February 7th of 2024, because that is when Saturn, moving direct, will again hit 7 degrees and 13 minutes of Pisces. This is from Aaron Sullivan's Retrograde Planets. If the station connects with a planet or angle in the natal horoscope, this time can feel interminable, as Saturn slows the quality of time. When stationing, Saturn remains within the same degree for almost 6 weeks on either side of the station, as I just noted. Upon its direction, one may feel as if moving in slow motion. It takes much time for Saturn's message to be incorporated into the conscious mind, but it is assured that the 9-month process of seeding, gestation, and birth has occurred. Something new has been born, but it will need a few months to become consciously manifest. Even then, she says, the experience of having been contained within one's innermost parameters leaves one with a sense of caution. Very gradually, new ego structures can be created, but the apparent disintegration of what was once thought to be oneself leaves its mark. The annual cycle of Saturn's retrogression can occur 2 or 3 times in one house, and the matters pertaining to that house undergo revision with each successive cycle, leaving no stone unturned. Wherever one's ego is invested in the house affairs, it dies for part of the year while a new usefulness is developed. The final passage over degree is the most notable and frequently marks the conscious and manifest birth of what was hinted at 9 months previously. So that's February, that date that I mentioned. And she goes on to say, usually it is quite tangible. If one has been working on a long-term project over that last period of time, it becomes complete, workable, and embodied in the final transit. Alternatively, a tentative plan or fantasy may come to reality in the last stages of the cycle. Negatively, it will finish off any antiquated or non-productive relationships, projects, or activities. It is human nature to delay at the threshold, and although one might struggle valiantly to hang on to them, outmoded and even damaging values or relationships long past their productive stage do end. There may be an extension or second wind at the final passage, but it too has its terminus, and if the retrograde cycle has coincided with one's own phase of withdrawal, internalization, gestation, and birth, so clearly demarcated by Saturn, then best to leave it alone. By the time Saturn actually passes back over the degree at which it turned retrograde, 9 months later, it is within 4 weeks of the conjunction point with the Sun. If such a delay has occurred, this marks the final conclusion of the cycle. So, that's the macrocosm, right? In the microcosm, as I said, we have the 3rd quarter lunar square on November 5th, along with the Mars quincunx to Chiron. And that 3rd quarter lunar square is the Leo moon. It's a fixed square, Leo moon to the Scorpio sun, right? So we're pushing through to the end of the lunar cycle. We're waning, we're releasing. We're trying to get out of this chaotic situation we're in, and that's part of the nature of this kind of crazy, quick alignment and realignment with different partners. So it's sort of like, feels like that, what's it, where you're dancing and you keep switching partners and then the music stops and whichever partner you're with, sort of like musical chairs but partners, that's the one you've got for now until the music starts again. That's kind of what it feels like, On November 6th, Venus trines Pluto. That might be some good news financially. We'll see. Maybe the house. I don't know. And Mercury trines Neptune, which is also maybe a little more clarity and communication. November 8th, Venus enters Libra. And I could make Venus more indecisive. I don't know why, but I always pick up the shadow side before the good part, right? Venus enters Libra, so partnerships are favored, right? But I don't know, because it can also make one more indecisive or passive-aggressive. Mercury sextiles Pluto, so research, facts, things that come out that, make sense. That might happen. The Sun will quincunx Chiron on November 8th. These are all on November 8th. And Venus quincunxes Saturn. So Venus enters Libra. We may be indecisive about who to adjust our partnerships with. And then Mercury sextiles Pluto, which is kind of like saying, okay, wait, now I got the facts. And yeah, but that's painful. The Sun quincunx Chiron, right? We've got to make an adjustment of some kind. It's not going to be pleasant. Mercury enters Sagittarius on November 10th. Mercury in Sagittarius, and it's in the worst light, is called hoof and mouth disease, where somebody can, over-exaggerate. Watch for that on the House or the Senate floor, perhaps, or out of the mouths of some of these people involved in conflicts, such as between Hamas, Hezbollah, Iran, Russia, Israel, Ukraine, etc., etc. And on November 11th, Mars will exact oppose Uranus. Now, that's going to be important when we hit the November 13th Scorpio new moon at 20 degrees and 22 minutes of Scorpio, because the Sun will then oppose Uranus exact. So that's going to be a little bit of a wild ride. We're going to talk about that next week. And until then, because it's time for me to sign off, thank you for joining me. I hope you found the information presented here helpful as you continue your karmic evolution in this lifetime. Please be sure to join me next week, November 10th, for another episode of Karmic Evolution's Astrologically Speaking podcast. Until then, may your journey be filled with karmic healing and the joy of greater consciousness. Namaste.
Long ago, before this day's confusion did begin, throughout the stars did we go wandering. Distance was no barrier, and time it had no hope. Free to come and free to go.